Okay, so I'm interviewing David Kilowsky. Is that how you say it?
Kilowsky, yeah.
Okay.
Actually, in Latvia, it's pronounced Kilowsky.
Kilowsky.
They pronounce it the O-W, K-I-L-O-W-S-K-Y, and the O-W is like an F in Latvia or Poland. So it's, they say Kilowsky, but it's Kilowsky in Australia, or Kilowsky.
All right. So
something
I'm
like that.
interviewing David about his really unique experiences living in an extremely remote, somewhat inhospitable region of Australia for almost a year in a sort of quasi-hermit type situation. So the first thing I wanted to ask you is how you first heard about this place and why on earth you were inspired to go there.
Okay, so geography of this place is in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, and the Kimberley region in those days, in the 80s and even before that, was actually a lot of it largely uncharted because it was so difficult to get into the Kimberley. There was just one station called Kimbolton Station, which was about probably 30 miles inland from where I was living. But it's also called, actual region of the area is called the Buccaneer Archipelago. So there's about 1,000 islands all in that whole area. And one of the things that made it very inaccessible was because of the tides there. So the ocean tides would go up to about 11.4 meters. And so between high water and low water on the king tide or spring tide, you'd have nearly 40 feet of water moving out every 6 hours, coming in and out. So it meant it was dangerous to go up by boat, and you had to know where you were going because there was no maps, not that there was no maps, but there was no landmarks as such to know where you are. And that sort of area, especially because 1,000 islands, you don't know what's mainland when you're in the boat, and you don't know what's islands because you've got no reference, until you get right near and we'll go around the coast and you realise, oh, actually this is an island type of thing. But I was in Broome at the time in the northwest, Western Australia, and Broome's a pearling town, famous pearling town, and I heard about the Kimberley area being very beautiful and like clear waters and very much uncharted, and no one had been in that area, or very few people. So that was the interest, actually, to explore something where very few people had been.
And there was some people living in that area. Did you know about that when you first heard about the place?
No, actually, and interesting enough, there's a famous chap, famous or infamous. His name was X and X X and X. Yeah, that was his name. X-E-N-E-X-X-E-N-E-X. That was his name. And he was living up in this area for about 8 years before I met him. And I was staying on a property in Broome, which the person who was on the property, he knew this hermit. And that hermit just happened to visit that property where I was staying. And as he left this property, he turned around, looked at me and said, there's a boat going up to this place in the Kimberley in the next week. If you're interested, it's coming back after 1 week just to come up and have a look. And it was just what I was thinking, so it was like the timing was perfect. And my working ethic in those days, I used to work for 4 months as a carpenter and a joiner, as a contractor, and then I'd have 8 months holiday. So that was, I could earn enough in 4 months to have 8 months holiday. So I'd already had my work, I'd already done my 4 months of work, and this was an opportunity, so I went up. So the 1 week boat, the sort of 2-day boat trip to get to the place from Derby, a town called Derby. And of course, when I got there, it was like a paradise. So
actually, before you tell us about the place, can you tell us about the journey to get there?
So the journey to get there was...
Not many people would go there because of that journey.
Well, whoever's been to Derby in the northwestern Western Australia is about probably a 2,000 people town, and it's full of bottle trees. You know the bottle tree, the baboa tree, they're shaped sort of like this bottle tree.
Oh, a bit like
huge.
In Madagascar. Like
Yeah,
whole
yeah. Africa, they have the same trees. Yeah, they call it baobab tree, baboa. So this town is full of those. It's extremely hot. It's like, and it's right at the back of a big sea inlet, a big bay. So in the northwest, all these towns, there's a lot of mangrove trees. So Derby has no beach. It's just like mud and mangroves.
Wow.
So you have the whole tides that come in and then go out.
Crocodiles?
Okay, crocodiles there. So leaving this town Derby was like leaving hell. You know, it was like, especially in the summer, like mid 40 degrees, mid 40s, and all this mud flats. And you'd have to go with the tide going out because the tides were so big. And they used to plan leaving Derby with the biggest tide, so you had more water flowing out with you. It means you travel with the tides. Yeah. And some of the tides would actually be traveling 10 knots, the water. So the boat we had only did 7 knots, and the tide is moving 10 knots. So you had to go with the tide. When the tide changed to come back in, you were trying to go against 10-mile-an-hour water coming towards you. So if your boat's only doing 7 knots, you're going 3 knots backwards, even though it looks like you're going forward. If you find a landmark, you can see that you're actually going backwards with the tide, even though you're in a boat and it looks like you're going, but it's all the water going underneath you, you know. So extremely dangerous. And we had to make across 50-mile stretch of the bay and get to a safe anchorage on the other side of the bay before the tide would turn to come back in. And when it did come back in, one trip I had up there where the boat with motor was a problem. So we had problem with the motor halfway. You know, the motor going and you can imagine, and then the tide were longer than 6 hours, and then the tide started coming back in, and on the horizon on the bay you could see a white line. And when the tide would change, it would come in a 2 or 3 foot wave across the top of the water, that actually the tide. So when that hit you, it of course spun the boat around and everything. And of course, we just made this other side of the bay, like it took ages and ages because we were just maybe doing half a knot, you know, with this problem with the motor. So this was one of the reasons why it was really dangerous, and people, if they did go up there, they'd go in a convoy to 1, 2, 3 boats at a time. So if any problem, then you had someone to, otherwise there's nothing out there. So then it would anchor overnight in this safe anchorage in a sort of like a lagoon part where they're out of the main tide movement. And you'd still have to be careful and anchor so you had at least 40 feet of water underneath the boat, so when the tide went out, you weren't sitting on the bottom, you know, or on reef. So you had to have it, they had to be aware of that. And then the next day it was about another 2-hour trip to get to the place where I lived. And this was a place called Cone Bay. And Cone Bay was a place which actually, the place where I lived was actually a sacred site of the indigenous people because of the fresh water. It had a freshwater spring there. And
you mentioned that in that whole area, that was the only place with fresh water for how far? Like
about 400 kilometres of coastline. That was the only place that had fresh water.
Wow.
So it was really no man's land. Without the fresh water, you could never stay there because it's just rock and spinifex.
Yeah.
The Kimberley is just all rock.
Yeah.
So.
And spinifex, isn't that really sharp?
It's like a thin reed. Spinifex is really in certain parts in the outback Australia where it's just spinifex, but the Kimberley has a lot of spinifex. And also the baobab tree, bottle tree is there, but mostly stunted growth of the fauna, you know. It's like short, not so huge tall trees, but everything's sort of stunted a bit in the Kimberley.
And when you arrived, did you think, oh, home, or did you think, oh, Lord?
No, well, it was very exciting. I mean, arriving, of course, it was planned so when you arrived in the boat, you arrived when the tide was at the level of the rocks so you could unload the supplies from the boat, because that was the main objective. Objective was to get there with all the supplies, which meant building supplies, food supplies, and you had to have enough water and enough petrol to get there and get back to the town at the end of your stay, you know. So you had to carry enough petrol, your water, of course, and then they were building their own like bush camps. So, you know, they'd find doors and windows and bits of this and cement and stuff like that, you know.
So when you say they,
well, there was when I was there, there was actually 3 others living there, and there'd been one chap had been living there about probably 3 years before I got there, and he was building out of stone, so he was using cement as well for that. And then there was one couple that were there, and he was for, I think, Indian descent, and his partner. And then X and X, who invited me there, but he didn't stay there when I went there for that 1 year. I stayed there nearly 1 year. He had a deal with his partner in Derby that he looked after her unit while she went to UK. She was from England, and that particular year, 82, he agreed to look after her unit while he stayed in. But he visited probably 2 or 3 times in that year when I was there.
Can you tell, since we're on the subject of X and X, he's an interesting kind of character, especially to go and settle in a remote place like that. So what was his deal? How did he end up?
Well, he was, it's funny because, I mean, he left the body in 2010, and he had 2 or 3 newspaper articles on him in the Western Australian Mail. And and they didn't know what to bury him under, which name, because he had 3 names. He had his name, which he called himself X and X, X and X, but his name before that was something, and he was from a very wealthy family in Victoria, Melbourne, in Australia. But he, at a young age, he was stowed away on a plane, got up in the wheel well of a plane and flew to Indonesia. He was like one of these chaps, and then in the 19, I think...
Sorry, he actually went to Indonesia in the wheelhouse?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
So, and another story he had was with, he was one of the first hippies in Australia to grow a big crop of marijuana up in Cairns. And this was like in, I think, 74, 75. And he got caught, and then he got put in prison. He escaped in Cairns, and then he tried to blow up the Cairns court. Yeah. Yeah, which didn't work. He didn't end up blowing it up, but he got caught again, and then he got put in solitary confinement. Wow. And in that solitary confinement, because he'd already been put in prison, escaped, and then tried this, they put him in a cage. He said he spent 4 years in a cage. Wow. And he said in that 4 years, when he was telling me this story, I can imagine, like, okay, if you're locked up in this confined space, that he learnt how to travel out of the physical body, and he called that like this astral traveling, how he'd move out of the body, and he travelled here and there and everywhere, just through his own, this astral traveling. So he realised, okay, the body's locked up in a prison, but actually I'm free. And then when he eventually did get out of jail, he wanted to go somewhere in Australia where there was no authorities, nothing to do with the law or whatever, but he wanted to find a spot where there's fresh water and he could do his own thing and be like detached from everything. So of course, the east coast of Australia is quite more established, of course. The west coast is far less, and the Kimberley even less inhabited. So he went to Derby, and he asked around any boat people, did they know where there's a place where fresh water was in the Kimberley, and he found someone, and they took him to this place, and that became his base, his camp. And actually how he also got there was also a story. There was 2 pearling luggers that sailed down from Darwin to Broome, pearling luggers, which they dive for the pearls in Broome. And when they sailed down, it's about 1,000 miles around the coastline, they got caught in the cyclone season. And the pearling lugger, the boats, are very unstable in rough weather. They have no skeg on the bottom of the boat because they are designed to go up on the sand and be on the sand, and when the big tides come in, they can float upright easily. If you've got a big skeg, if it's leaning over too much, they'll just fill up with water when the tide comes in. So they went somewhere on the coast of the Kimberley coastline in that King Sound area and put ballast in the boat, the bottom of the boat, which is rocks, and to keep it more stable. And the story was that this rock they put in the bottom of the boat was 70% silver, which they didn't know at the time, because this was during the cyclone, and they just got this ballast from somewhere on that coast, put it in the boat and got back to Broome eventually, and realized that this rock was 70% silver. So he heard about this and he thought, okay, if I make a base somewhere in the Kimberley there, I can go out prospecting, looking for this, to look for this silver deposit, you know. So he never ever found the silver, but that's how he ended up in that place.
Oh.
And he had one point, he was sharing with me, he had 3 years there without seeing a single person arrived. It was so isolated.
But he would have had to go back to get food, or did people drop food off, or how did?
Yeah, somehow, I don't know how, when that time, I think he grew some things. I mean, even when I went there, they had beautiful garden of fruit trees, papaya, bananas, rock melons, beans, pumpkins, this type of thing. So there was enough there to.
Okay.
Yeah.
And could you tell us a bit about the geography, in terms of like what's the bay like and what's the terrain like?
Well, it's basically,
and what's the wildlife like?
Yeah. So the terrain is all rock. The Kimberley is all rock. There's no flat ground as such. So this was one of the things which was very interesting there, because for me, the only time I got to walk on flat ground was when it was a very low tide. You could go down to the ocean edge and walk along this little part of this, like a lagoon, where there was sand, where you didn't have to look where you were stepping. Now, it's because it's all rock, you're literally walking rock to rock like that. So very difficult to move around there. Even the bay itself was 7 miles deep and about 5 miles across. And just down from where I was living was there was an island, which actually now has a helipad on it, and it's a whole barramundi fishing, breeding, cultivating sort of area. They breed the barramundi there and these things, and a mother of pearl shell. But this particular part where I was living had fresh water coming out of the ground. There's a beautiful spring that run all year round, the fresh water out of the ground, still runs today. So it's been running for, I don't know. Yeah, and even the Aboriginal people hundreds of years ago, they knew this was a place of water, fresh water. But yeah, probably if you look at it from a certain point, it probably look a bit like the Greek islands. If you're on the top of the Greek islands and looking in the ocean, you've got these little sandy coves and these high cliffs, about 100 feet, 90 to 100 feet cliffs all around the bay. And in the low tide, between low tide, you could walk to the next cove on the sandy beach and go there for an hour or two, and then come back quickly before the tide come in.
And was it safe to swim in that ocean?
Well, there was crocodiles and sharks.
Oh, great. Yeah.
That was one thing which probably, from my experience there, was probably the biggest fear at times, was actually if you wanted to do a boat trip, of course you had to do it at high tide, because you had to get to the boat. If it was low tide, the boat would be on the water, and you had to then get up down from the cliffs to the boat, you know. Yeah. So the only way out to the boat was to swim out to the boat. So when you swam out to the boat, when you knew that there was sharks that had come in the high tide for feeding, and there was crocodiles there, until you got the last foot in the boat,
yeah,
it was like then the heart would start to slow down, you know. So that was yeah.
Wow, yeah.
But animals there, wildlife, there was rock wallabies, there was, of course, big pythons, kangaroo rats, they were locals there, and then you had all sorts of, you know, the standard sort of, there was death adder snakes, there's pythons, there was big scorpions, like really big scorpions, centipedes, and then you had we had one thing where we used to have a bit of a, we used to draw straws, you know, if we went down to the coast, to the boat, because you'd have to walk from this valley down, follow the waterway right down to the ocean, which from where I built my place, it would take me about 15 minutes to walk to the ocean. You follow the spring around and through bracken and ferns and all and then there's huge big rock pools, which are like a swimming pools, a natural swimming pool, so beautiful setting. But we used to have this thing where we draw these 3 straws, like the first person, whoever got the first choice went first on the path. And the first person on the path, as you know, when you walk through the bush, you get a lot of spider webs, yeah? And the second person, they had these things there called the green ants. I don't know, you know the green ants, they're like a bull ant, big bull ant, and they make a cocoon with 3 leaves of a certain tree, big leaves, flat leaves, and they join them together and they make their nest inside that. So it's just a green like a cocoon, but you don't see them because they're the same leaves as a tree, you know. So if you walked into one and disturbed them, they'd all come out, and when they come out, and if they got on you, they'd just lock on with their teeth, and they just hang on with their teeth, and all their legs are in the air, you know, and they hang on just. So the second person would get the green ants because the first person would disturb the nest, and of course you have to start picking these things off, you know, and then the last person had to watch out for the crocodile, because the crocodile will always come up behind. And they had a dog there, and it's well known, of course, in crocodile country that if you have a dog, the first choice of the crocodile will always be the dog. So it was a lovely dog, but that was...
While we're on the topic of crocodiles, you told a story once about the crocodile waiting for a long time. What was
well, yeah, this X and X, he told a story once. He was in his camp and he heard this banging sound. Because you know what happens there, I mean, you have to imagine this place is, the closest other people are 70 miles away, yeah. There's no engine sound, there's no sounds of anything other than the nature. And your hearing becomes very, very clear as well. And they say if you're within a 20-mile radius of any petrol engine, that will actually affect the vibration out to 20-mile radius, full round, that has an effect. So this place was way out of that zone. So everything becomes amplified, and of course being all cliffs and rock face, you get a lot of echo and bouncing. So sometimes you hear a sound from here, but actually it might be coming from over there, but it's bouncing. So it's sometimes, but anyway, he heard this banging, he walked up these rocks, climbed up these rocks, which we used to call the staircase, and you could look down into the cove where the boat was anchored. And anyways, he said he saw that the boat was there and there was this big crocodile alongside and it was banging its tail against the side of the boat. So he thought he'd have a bit of a game, and he went down to the coast and he splashed in the water and made this big lot of thing, and then he climbed up the rocks and just watched to see what this crocodile would do. Well, it come right up to where he splashed around and was just waiting there. So he said that scared him a bit. It was just waiting there. So he eventually went up to his camp, but that night he heard the crocodile coming up the spring. And it come up and it sat right between his place and the spring and waited there for 3 days for him. And he said he had...
Luckily he had water, otherwise...
Yeah, he had water. He had boiling water on his stove going, and he had an escape route to get up on top of his roof, you know, just in case the crocodile, you know, charged him. And
you mentioned that you kind of never could really relax. Like whenever you move around, you have to become hyper aware of where you're standing.
Well,
what's going on.
Yeah, it was like I mean, I realized later you know, the beauty and one of the specialties, which I guess that become automatic, you could say second nature, was like you really had to pay full attention to each step, because I mean, I didn't wear shoes, I didn't wear clothes for the 1 year. But just you're moving around, because you didn't have shoes, and there was a lot of, not just the animals or the scorpions and all this sort of thing, but there was a lot of big thorns and thistle type plants where, you know, they were on different parts, so you had to be really super alert. But somehow I felt that was part of the whole, the experience of you becoming more present and just really being where you are, you know, because this X and X, he said to me, he said, whoever comes up to this place, it will change your life. And he said also, he said another thing was just this, that because of this situation, having no communication with outside, it meant that if something happened,
that's it.
Yeah, there was no, you know, if you got bitten by a snake or accident, it's 2 days journey to town by boat, and that 2 days journey could only be done twice a month with the right tides, if the weather was good enough. If the weather was bad, then you wouldn't even set off, because you had to cross a 50-mile open bay, and in 3 meter,
that's a long
3 meter, 4 meter long boat is not easy. Actually, he used to travel up there in a 3 meter dinghy, aluminium dinghy. It used to take him 4 days around the coast, around the bay. And he used to have to anchor overnight and keep a fire going all night because the crocodiles were there. So the crocodiles won't come near the fire. So you had to keep a fire going all night. Otherwise, you'd be the food for the crocodile, you know. So, and so that was interesting, you know.
Okay, could you tell us where you actually stayed in this inhospitable landscape?
Well, I was there,
what were the living
yeah.
conditions like?
Well, it was a bush camp. I mean, it was very basic. I mean, like really basic. It was, you know, imagine all this stuff that was brought there was brought by boat from the nearest town 70 miles away, and 2 days to get there. So it was, you know, like...
No IKEA.
There was no, it was like, you know, actually tarpaulin roof, and many of them over the years put on top of each other, you know. So actually myself being a carpenter, I eventually put a pitch roof on his place, you know, properly pitch roof. So otherwise in the monsoon we have to get sticks and push up the water, big pockets of water, and push them to the outside of the roof, you know.
Yeah.
But it was all done with stone, and it was, you know, a typical bush camp, you could say. So I had a bed. I mean, I had a really good mosquito net, which was like worth its weight in gold. It was just like, that was, if you had a good mosquito net at night, you can put that in and tuck it all in so nothing crawls in, you know, into your bed. So that was very important. But I mean, it was funny story, because before I left to go to this place, yeah, they had some artist friends that were in Derby, and they were talking and joking about, they had their special sitting spot in Cone Bay, and they had a little treasure they'd hidden somewhere, and all of the other 3 people were there, which I didn't know. I just met these people, and they were joking how they all tried to look for this little treasure and no one found it, you know. So I just heard them talking of this. Anyway, when I got to Cone Bay, and after some time, and I was exploring, I climbed up this rock face, and I was right on the edge of the rocks, like a pyramid-like edge of the pyramid, and I looked down at the spring, and then down at this side another valley. And when I sat in a spot, and I sort of it was nicely shaded with some trees, and it was like a big rock chair in the side of this sort of pyramid sort of thing. And I thought, wow, what an amazing spot. And anyway, when I brushed away the leaves of the floor, there was these beautiful layered coloured granite stones that had been laid in the floor. And then I thought somebody had been here before, you know, like it was just, this thing hit me, wow, this is somebody's sitting spot. So when I got to this spot, instantly I sort of like, I turned around, I climbed around these rocks, and this other rock and another rock, and then there's this rock, and I pulled this rock out from another rock, and inside was this tin. So I come back to this sitting spot, I opened this tin, and there was another tin inside with this beautiful, I remember this beautiful golden drinking mug, like one of these trophies, and inside was a pipe and a bit of stash, pick, a lighter. So I thought, okay. So I sat down, I had this pipe. Anyway, it was like this feeling of, and this was a little treasure they were all looking for. and they couldn't find, and I just got there and I just got drawn, I just got taken to this spot, you know, like it was all rocks, but I went to these, and so, and I had this feeling like, it was like this sort of strong feeling that everything was just a game, you know, this real sort of like thing of, this is just a game we're playing, you know. And anyway, from that point, I sort of turned around and walked around on a leeward side of this sort of valley, and I stood on this rock ledge and I looked out over the islands and the bay, and I instantly thought, this is the spot I wanted to build. And I'd always had this dream that, being a carpenter, that I wanted to build my own place straight from the most natural setting possible.
Just like the settlers would have.
Yeah. So I saw there was a forest there was a lot of dead trees, beautiful straight trees, and a lot of them were dead in the forest. And then I saw this spot on the side of the cliff where I stood, which became my fireplace, the rocks, in the rocks. And then I saw the other rocks, and I saw how I could wedge a log between the rocks to make a main support, and then build out from that. So I spent, I think I built the place in like 11 days,
and
7.
what kind of tools did you have with you?
I had a bow saw, which I got from the main camp. I had a chisel and a hammer, and I had 12 big copper nails. That was all I used. So I had 3 tools and 12 nails.
Wow.
But because I had skills in carpentry, I knew how to make the proper joints and join everything, so you didn't actually need nails or any wire or anything like this. I built it all from like that, you know. But the thing what happened as well, one of the 3 people that were there, this chap was quite jealous that I'd come to this place and felt so at home too quick for him. Because for me it was like this dream just unfolded, and it was like the things, building the place from the forest and
finding that stash.
And that stash, well, it was just a little bit, but it was very special. And just, I guess it was, and anyway, he was so annoyed and angry that I'd found this sitting spot, which was his artist friend's spot. Obviously, I found out later, and I never ever told him I found the stash. I never wasn't game to say to him I found that. But he come climbing, one time he come climbing up the cliffs, and he went through the motion of pulling me off the thing and throwing me off the cliff. And he was so angry that I'd found this.
He went through the motion.
Well, he went to throw me off the cliff, but at the last minute he was like, got frozen, and he couldn't go through with it. Like it was a feeling at the time, I had the feeling that really I was in a peaceful state, and it was like that was the protection. I didn't have one, I remember it was like I didn't have one thought of fear or anything what this happened, and that was like the protection. And then after that, that's when I ended up building my place. I thought, okay, this could be dangerous with this chap. And anyway, I found this spot, and I thought, okay, I don't need anything from the main camp. I had to borrow the bow saw and just 3 tools, and that was it. So I had my other supplies, mosquito net and whatever little things I brought. And so that sort of pushed me into building, of course. And then I was so determined to, because it was monsoon time as well, coming up to monsoon, that I ended up building this place in like 7-10 days or something. And I remember I wore all my fingers back to almost no skin, pulling the logs up the cliff, because I had to cut the root system off, then the branches, and then drag the log up the cliff by myself. And then of course everything was done, and then I had levers and all sorts of things to lever it all up, and all sorts of things I made to
And you were telling once that generally people could only come to visit, and then they had to go and come back.
Yeah, well, this was...
You somehow had an exemption from that.
Well, no, that was why this was a drama in the beginning with this chap, because I wanted to build, and he was saying, no, if you want to build, we have this law that you had to go away and then come back. And for me, I thought, well, okay, this place is so difficult to get to, and I don't need everything to build with is there. It's like it's nothing I have to bring there to do that. It was all just the natural forest, the trees. So I didn't, I wasn't accepting that rule.
Good.
And he,
supposed to be rule breakers.
yeah, and he wasn't the person who invited me there, the hermit X and X, but he wasn't there that time. But psychically, And I think because he had this experience of astral travel, he must have visited, because he knew when he did visit, and after I think 4.5 months, he knew exactly what had been happening. And I had the experience being in when I built the place, I had the experience of this like bodiless spirit coming to me and move out. And I've had this experience before, and then this other chap in the camp said, yeah, I come up to visit you last night. And he described what I was doing. And I said, how do you do that? You know, like, and so this was this astral traveling, but he used to consciously come up and visit me. And I'd have the experience of this bodiless soul come into me, like this presence. But then the next day he'd explain what I was doing. So I thought, wow, I was fascinated because I didn't know anything about these things. And because I had the experience of that, I thought, oh, there must be something, like something is, yeah, discover. And
that kind of brings me nicely to maybe the next chapter of the interview, which is sort of your inner experiences. But I thought it'd be nice to move outside just to have a bit of a green back.